Hey everyone, it's Jessica Edwards in Wilmington, North Carolina. So sometimes we get asked questions about what's standard for the actual closing when that occurs. And you know, this varies from state to state. So when a real estate closing occurs in the state of North Carolina, in most states, it occurs at an attorney's office. Here in Wilmington, and probably, I don't know, it would be interesting to see how it is in different cities, but I would assume most now, the buyer and seller do not go to the closing table together. So years back, and I'm sure still in some states, depending on how real estate closings work with attorneys and different things, they may sit down at the table together. But here in North Carolina and Wilmington specifically, the seller and the buyer don't go to the closing and sit down together. So very often when you buy a house, you never even meet the sellers. And that's normal. But what happens is the buyer has a closing scheduled, and so they actually go sit down at the attorney's office. Usually takes about an hour, just give or take, depending on the lending, if there is lending, the paperwork that's involved. But they go through all of that. All the seller does is at some point, typically the week prior to closing, sign the deed that has to be notarized with the attorney. So typically the seller goes in, meets with the attorney very quickly, signs the deed, it's notarized, and then they sign the closing statement once that is completed. And that usually happens ideally a day or two before closing, but sometimes the day of closing. But the buyer and seller here do not sit down at the closing table together. And you know, a lot of that, if you think about it, it makes sense, because the buyer, when they're going through all that, you know, loan package and everything with the attorney, that's a lot of their personal information, their credit history, their social security numbers, their income, all those things. So that's very personal and private information. And there's no reason really for the seller to sit there through all of that when all they're doing is signing the deed. So that's how it works in, I don't know if it's that way in all of North Carolina, probably I would say for the most part, but definitely here in Wilmington, that's how that works. So a lot of times we'll have sellers ask, or sometimes we'll have sellers think that they're actually going to go, you know, sit at the closing with the buyer, and that just doesn't happen. So it's very easy. The closing process, if you will, for the seller is very, very easy, because, you know, the most important thing is getting that deed signed and notarized ahead of time, and that's done prior to closing. So anyways, just a little tidbit about closings. I had a question from someone today about that and just thought I would share. If you need any other questions or anything, feel free to email us, and of course check us out at thecarolinasfinest.com. Thanks so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.